Travis, you want to lead us to prayer?
Father God, we just thank you for this beautiful morning. Just the freedom to have together here to study the Word. That's what we prepare our hearts to take in what you have.
Amen. Okay,
We're to chapter 5, and we're going to talk about Belshazzar. There's three secular sources that are referenced, that they either use them to confirm what the Bible says or try to dispute what the Bible says. And it's the Babylonian Chronicles, writing from a guy named Herodias and Josephus, using history and writing at the time of Christ and writing back. But according to the Babylonian Chronicles, the date of this feast that Belshazzar has happened on October the 12th, 539 BC. So the army of Cyrus entered Babylon without a battle. Herodias says that Babylon fell during the time of a festival, and Daniel's use of Belshazzar as the king was used to criticize the book of Daniel for years, until in the 1900s. The archaeologists found all kinds of material to prove that that Belshazzar was Nabonidus' son, the other king that we've been talking about all the time, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. So the Bible says that Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar's father. But the Hebrew word that's used for that is used in lots of other places. It can mean father, grandfather, or great-grandfather, somebody in your line. But since the Nabonidus was actually king, until archaeologists found all kinds of material talking about Belshazzar also, Daniel was really attacked. But once that showed up, the attacks kind of stopped.
Is that because Is that because that when this come out, he said he would give him the third?
Yeah. That's one of the proofs that he was a co-regent, not the king. So Daniel, over and over and over, archaeology proves the Bible. Especially, it has proved the book of Daniel and Isaiah. So Nabonidus was the king, but he was an absentee king. He didn't do any of the actual ruling. He just was on a long vacation. Sounds like the president, right?
Like he was smart.
Yeah. So Josephus tried to solve the problem before archaeology did it, so he tried to say they were the same person. But I'll read you this. Archaeologists' discoveries over the past century have helped clarify the alleged discrepancy and attest to the history as well as the antiquity of the book of Daniel. The discovery of the Babylonian Chronicle finally resolved the apparent problem. Nabonidus was an absent king who abandoned the city of Babylon and its religious festivals and left his son Belshazzar to rule in his place as crown prince. This continued for at least 5 years, from the 7th through the 11th year of Nabonidus' reign, and probably longer. Texts have been uncovered that elevate Belshazzar to the functional role king during the absence of his father. And like Scott said, his role of co-regent was why he could only offer a third, instead of a second like Nebuchadnezzar did. So, chapter 5 runs parallel to the chapter 4 for the reason of it. So God's relation to Babylon's last king mirrors his revelation to Babylon's first king. Nebuchadnezzar learned that those who walk in pride, God is able to humble. And then Daniel tells Belshazzar in chapter 5, sadly you, his son, and the word here is a Hebrew word again that can mean grandson or great-grandson. Huh?
Where it says some places Jesus was the son of David or the line of David.
Yeah, like even in the New Testament, it'll say somebody begat somebody else, but it may skip a couple of generations. Okay.
They called Jesus the son of David
Right.
all the time.
Right. It's the same way. The word that's used here is not specific. It's like what we're talking about. Okay. But critics pick up on that stuff. Sadly, you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. Following his time of humiliation, Nebuchadnezzar honored him who lives forever. But as for Belshazzar, the God in whose hand is your breath and whose all your ways you have not honored. So basically the point of chapter 5 is the same point as chapter 4, to show that God's sovereign and he can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, to whoever he wants. All right? So we'll read first 4 verses, I think. Yeah. So King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels, that has the idea of when we think of tasting the wine, you might think of taking a drink and swirling around, spitting it out. That has the idea of engorging yourself with it. Okay. When he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the kings and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So they had a big drunken party, basically. And the drunker they got, the more they praised these other gods. So remember back in chapter 2 when Nebuchadnezzar saw the statue and Daniel interpreted it, he told him his kingdom would fall to another kingdom that was represented by the chest and the arms, right? Which had the idea of being 2, which turns out to be the Medes and the Persians, who, when Nebuchadnezzar, through this big feast, had besieged the city. The only thing left, based on what these other documents say, the only thing left of Babylon Empire was the city of Babylon at this point. That's it. Everything else the Medes and the Persians had taken. But the city of Babylon was so fortified that they wasn't really concerned about falling. They had a river go through the middle of it. They had evidently, based on history, they had stores of food laid up. They thought they could survive for years and that nobody could get in. So when they started this party, they wasn't really worried about the army outside the city. So it was during the near quarter of a century between chapter 4 and 5, so almost 25 years has happened since Nebuchadnezzar regained his sanity. Okay. that the further revelations given to Daniel in chapter 7 and 8 occurred. So chapter 7 and 8 happened chronologically before chapter 5. But they don't have to do with any chronological order. It's just when God gave Daniel these two visions. It happened during the earlier reign of Nebuchadnezzar, of Belshazzar. Are you still with me? It don't really make any difference. You don't really even need to know that. But I think God sticks chapter 5 in there to show the history of everything that happened and when Babylon fell. But he actually gave Daniel these two visions before it fell. Okay? So, chapter 7 was revealed to Daniel in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So this is getting to be, whenever this happens, is at least 7 years later. This happened, he got chapter 7 in the first year. And the vision of the ram and the he-goat in chapter 8 happens in the third year. So God put those details in there so there wouldn't be any doubt about when they happened, but he goes and shows the fall of Babylon before he actually tells us about what he gave him. Does that make sense? I felt like I stumbled around there.
Big overview and then zoom it back in.
Say it again.
Gives like a broad overview and then zoom it back in.
Yeah, to what was actually happening. Yeah. Okay, so Belshazzar began his reign in 553, and chapter 7 and 8 occurred, it's longer than I thought, 12 and 14 years before this. Okay. Chapter 7, 12 years, chapter 8, 14 years. So the Cyrus, by the way, when's the first mention of Cyrus? How many of y'all know that in the Bible? Isaiah, which we can turn that around, look at it if you want, which is over 150 years before this. God revealed to Isaiah that a man named Cyrus would rise and he would be the one that would let the people go. So here he is, showing up on the scene. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle, the final days of Babylon were chaotic, with Nabonidus trying to put down a rebellion inside the city, which the Bible don't talk about that, but evidently this was going on, while simultaneously facing the Babylonian, facing the army outside. When Cyrus attacked another city on the Tigris, the inhabitants of that city revolted, and Nabonidus massacred the confused inhabitants. So here's what's going on. So Cyrus and his army is conquering the cities around it. The people are fed up with, evidently, with Nabonidus and Belshazzar not doing anything about it. So they revolt against him, and he slaughters them instead of fighting the other army.
Part of what I've understood about the whole thing going on is Babylon brought in people every country that they captured, just like when they took Jerusalem, they took people captive. But they did that from everywhere that they conquered. Cyrus was passing out propaganda basically amongst all the people, saying that if I conquer Babylon, I'll let you go home.
Yeah.
So all those people
that
kind of switched to his side.
On the night that Babylon fell, Nabonidus had been defeated and fled, and he left Belshazzar in charge of the remaining forces in the city. So after he slaughtered a bunch of his own people He was engaged in another battle. He lost it, and he got out of Dodge. So I don't know whether they're throwing this feast because he got out of Dodge, or they're trying to.
And say it's kind of like an eat and drink and be merry for
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, maybe trying to appease these other gods because nothing else is working, right? Even though they didn't think that anything could actually happen to them. So Nabonidus assumed the throne in 556, 6 years after the death of Belshazzar. There was probably 2 other kings in between. And Belshazzar would have been a teenager when Nebuchadnezzar died. So that made him old enough to be co-regent. Belshazzar's mother was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, which comes into play in a little bit. So that's a reason for all this background. Okay, so that word in Hebrew for father or son or whatever, says one linguist says that neither in Hebrew nor in Chaldee is there any word for grandfather or grandson. Forefathers are called fathers or fathers' fathers, but a single grandfather or forefather is never called father's father, but always father only. So anyway, that's a part of that. And according to Herodias, Babylon was 14 miles square. So what town's 14 miles away? Fargo?
Fargo's about 12 miles, I think.
12. So how far is Moreland? 10. How far y'all live out?
It would be about 14
Okay.
miles from here to Arkansas.
So imagine a square out to Curtis. That's a big area, right? 14 miles square, with outer walls 87 foot thick and 350 foot high, with 100 bronze gates in the walls, a system of inner and outer walls with water moat between them. So broad and strong were the walls that there was enough room for a 4-horse chariot to turn on top of the wall. Herodias pictures hundreds of towers at appropriate intervals reaching another 100 foot into the air above the top of the wall.
It was 350 feet without the towers.
Yeah.
Aren't these windmill towers about 320 feet up or something like that?
I don't know.
When the blade,
Yeah.
the blade sticking
Yeah.
out the top.
So that'd be about how tall the wall was. And then they had these 100-foot towers on top of that. So if you had rocks and arrows and burning oil and stuff like that, you could cause people a lot of trouble down below you. Right? So the Euphrates River flowed through the middle of the city in a general north to south direction, was bordered by walls on each side to protect the city from attack from the river. A bridge spanned the Euphrates River connecting the east section and the west section, and the hanging gardens were in that area where the bridge was. So it's hard for the Babylonians to believe that anybody was going to be able to take their city. And they had their confidence in their God, in their gods, and they had confidence in their city. Right? So, the handwriting on the wall. How many of you knew about this before you knew it was even in the Bible? You ever heard the phrase handwriting on the wall? Tons and tons of phrases like that actually come from the Bible, but people don't realize that. So, immediately the fingers of a human. So what were they doing at this point? They were in a drunken party praising the gods of stone, wood, and idol and all this kind of stuff.
And weren't they eating and drinking out of the temple?
eating and drinking out of the temple.
Like the cups and
Yeah.
all those.
Yeah, all of the holy things that had been consecrated to God. Immediately, I forgot what's the verse 4 say?
That he called for the
Is that where it says they were praising all? Yeah, okay. So once they started doing that, it says immediately. Once they're using these temple vessels, praising these false gods, using them, and as soon as they do that, immediately the fingers of a human hand, and I've always thought that's interesting. He didn't see the whole hand. He just saw the fingers. Isn't that?
It made me think of when Jesus wrote in the sand.
Yeah, or even however he gave the 10 Commandments. Yeah. Immediately the fingers of a human hand, and that's always kind of fascinating too, it looked like a human hand, appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. Now Nebuchadnezzar had been concerned and scared before, but he never peed his pants and couldn't stand and with his knees knocking together. So he's
Manly man.
yeah. Okay, so the king called loudly to bring in all of these people who tell these things. And the king declared to the wise, by the way, we're going to see that Daniel has been relegated to nothing at this point. He has no function inside the government whatsoever. Nabonidus was the third person to take over after Nebuchadnezzar, and he's just pretty much been forgotten. Right? Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation, and this is another thing that the critics use to try to attack the book, because when Daniel interprets the writing, it's in Aramaic, and everybody there would have been able to read it. So, and we'll talk more about that, why they couldn't read it and why Daniel had to. Okay. Shall be clothed with purple, have a chain of gold around his neck, shall be third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. Okay, so the fingers of this hand is visible. I could read you how big they found a throne room where they did parties and stuff like that. I could read you how big and everything that is, but the verse 5 that says the writing appeared opposite the lampstand, in what they found, it says it may have appeared in an area of greater illumination than the rest of the room, and thus would have attracted more attention. So God's making a point to say it was opposite where the light was, so everybody could see it. So the effect on Belshazzar was immediately his face lost its color, his limbs lost their strength, and his knees knocked together. I mean, that's scared, right? So they calls all of these wise men, and none of them can read the writing. And he tells them what all he'll give them if they can. But when Daniel reads the writing as Aramaic, the critics say that this can't have happened because everybody would have been able to read it. And the people who try to explain it away logically say, well, apparently the language was in a different form of Aramaic, or they couldn't see it, or whatever. But why can't God just be God and keep anybody from knowing it until Daniel sees it?
If there was something in another language that you didn't understand and I was going to read it and interpret to you, I would tell you in your language anyway, so I don't really understand.
That's true, and that's one of the things that brings out about it. But it doesn't really have to be explained away. You know, I mean, I know that's what he was trying to do. But if God wanted to put it up there in Aramaic and keep them from seeing it and understanding it, he could do it, right? Or like she said, if Daniel interpreted, he would interpret it in their language. So.
Well, it doesn't say that they didn't understand, they couldn't read the writing. It says whoever reads this writing, and it shows me the interpretation. It's like Nebuchadnezzar said,
Yeah, but
show me the interpretation of this dream.
well, the writing is the interpretation in this case. What the writing says is what's going to happen. So.
They didn't know what that meant.
Well, yeah, they didn't. I mean,
Why do you know that it's in Aramaic?
because that's what he read it in.
Well, yeah, but I'm with you.
Yeah, that's what she said.
That was Hebrew.
It's very possible it could have been Hebrew. But anyway, I don't know why people get hung up on that kind of stuff is what I'm saying.
What's it matter? He wanted Daniel to read.
Yeah. Well, none of the rest of them could. God, you're saying God wanted. When you say he, yeah. God wanted Daniel to read it because God wanted Daniel back in power or back in influence or whatever. So.
It seems silly to dispute why people couldn't read it if you accept that fingers just appeared and wrote it.
Say it again.
I said it seems silly to dispute why nobody else
Yeah.
could read it if fingers.
If you accept the fingers, yeah, that's a pretty good point. Yeah. If these fingers appeared and wrote it, why?
I believe that part, but I don't believe that.
Yeah, that's pretty good. So, the queen, which is his mother, Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, because of the words of the king and the lords came in the back. So evidently she hadn't been invited, or she didn't want to be there, or whatever. But she heard what was going on, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you, or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods.
So that queen, though, isn't Belshazzar's wife.
Say it again.
It's his mom. That's probably his mom that comes in, not his wife.
Did I say wife?
No, you said
Okay.
queen, but there's got to be two queens. If there's two kings, or there don't have to be.
Yeah.
Probably is. So that was probably his mom.
Yeah, almost everybody that I can read thinks this was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter or his mom. Yeah. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, and that's that word again, your father, the king, made him chief of all of these people, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So Queen Mother shows up, says, you don't have to worry about any of this stuff. You don't have to lose your color, get too scared. We can tell you, there's a person in here who can tell you what this is all about. In effect, she come in, she said, get yourself together. And that's what she said. Pull yourself together. You're a king. You go find the answer to it. Kind of like a mom. Your mom ever come in and tell you something like that? Straighten up, dude. I mean, right? So her suggestion was to get Daniel, and she said he had the spirit that he's able to do that, and he did it all for Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel's called in to solve the writing. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah." So Belshazzar had some understanding of Daniel. "I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you," and I don't know whether that meant because his mom had just told him that or he knew that from before. But and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom were found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple, have a chain of gold around your neck, and you should be third ruler in the kingdom. Which is what we were talking about earlier, because he was the second ruler. He could only give somebody to be the third ruler, because Nebuchadnezzar was the king. He was the co-regent or king under him. So he offered to make Daniel the third most powerful person in the kingdom. Actually, verse 13 seems either the Bible didn't record everything his mother told him, or he knew a little bit about Daniel already. Right? One of those two things. Yeah, if he was a teenager when Nebuchadnezzar was still alive, he would have had to know all of this. He would have been running across him daily. Right? Okay. So Daniel rebukes Belshazzar. You know, he really never got what's the right with Nebuchadnezzar like he gets with Belshazzar.
Right. He's old now, he don't care.
Huh?
He's old now, he don't care.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Either that or he had no respect at all for Belshazzar. He seemed to have some respect for Nebuchadnezzar.
Well, if he walked in there, and Nebuchadnezzar had at the very least wet himself, then it would be hard to be real.
And seeing the vessels from the temple there. So his tone here is totally different than it was with Nebuchadnezzar. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, remember what he would almost always say to Nebuchadnezzar? "Oh, King, live forever." It's not here.
Hope this doesn't happen to you.
Yeah. Let your gifts be for yourself and your rewards to another. In other words, I mean, this is not respectful at all. This is not humbling. This is not right. This is, why do I have to deal with you type of attitude. Okay. I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, he's going to give him a little sermon to start with, by the way. That's not too little of a sermon, but kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And the idea is here, he gave that to Nebuchadnezzar, but you don't have it. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will, And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. Though you knew all of this. So, I think the idea is Nebuchadnezzar didn't have that understanding. God went through everything with him. He had already received all of that lot. Right? There's more required of him because of what God had already done. Is that not true of us?
Probably why Daniel didn't respect him either. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah, I think if he could have said it just that way, I mean, I think if he was using our culture and our language, that's exactly what he said.
with gentleness and kindness.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think he would have followed that part of it. There's a little bit more here. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you and your lords, your wives, your concubines, and drink wine from them. And you praise the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways you've not honored. So that's a pretty good sermon, right? I mean, it could be called that, right? It was definitely a rebuke. I don't think there's any doubt that he held Belshazzar in contempt. Do you? I just think he recognized him as king, and he gives him his sermon, condemns him for what he's done. In verse 17, he announced that he would interpret the writing, but he didn't do until he preached the sermon. Daniel reminded Belshazzar that God gave Nebuchadnezzar his great kingdom and the honor that went with him, and then he told about all the power and everything he had, and then he told about him going insane and then coming back. But Belshazzar's situation, his knowledge of Nebuchadnezzar's humbling, made it all the more blasphemous taking these vessels captured in Jerusalem and using it. And in verse 23, Daniel said, you're praising these gods which don't see, hear, or know, but the true God in whose hand is your breath, you've not honored. Most likely the king had to struggle between how he was going to deal with this. Don't you imagine? His immediate inclination probably would have been to kill him. But he hadn't heard the interpretation yet. I don't think nobody ever talked to Belshazzar like that before in his life. Do you think?
Well, even his mom was all respectful and,
Yeah. He was still the king. He still had this power over you.
The way he's described, it seems like he would be more inclined to fly off the handle than even Nebuchadnezzar probably.
I think you're right.
Killed.
Yeah. So I think probably he was fuming. But he still needed the interpretation. Right? Because whoever said that a while ago, Daniel basically said, you can stick it. I mean, you
He
know.
was also terrifying.
Yeah, he was.
It's hard to get up a whole lot of that. Knees are knocking and you're wet.
Yeah, that's true.
Just get up on it.
Yeah. Okay, so then from his presence you've not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed, and this is the writing that was inscribed. Those 4 words. Depending on who you listen to, who you talk to, how you pronounce them. Best I know, it's Mene, Tekel, Pharsin. I have no clue whether that's right or not. That's Aramaic. That's what he said was written. This is the writing that was inscribed. So that's one of the things that kind of take away what Alicia said earlier, as it says this writing was inscribed. A lot of interpreters take that to mean that's what was on the wall. Don't necessarily have to mean that. That could be the meaning of what was inscribed. So anyway, not for most of us, like Derek said, that's not the somebody writing on the wall should have been the big deal. Okay, so here's the interpretation. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, T-E-K-L, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Okay, let's see what I have down here. Okay, I'm going to...
Is that weird that it says in verse 28 Perez, and in verse 25 it says the Pharsin?
I'm going to explain it here in just a second.
Okay.
Okay, so Mene is related to a Hebrew word mana. A mana was equal to 50 shekels. The word can also be translated to count or to number. So the word is repeated twice, perhaps for emphasis. Daniel interpreted it to mean God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. That was Daniel's interpretation of it.
Anytime the Bible is being emphasis, we use bold letters, and in the scripture it says it twice, like when Jesus is truly, truly Lord.
Yeah.
It's just an emphasis on that.
Yeah.
Whatever it is.
Tekel is related to the Hebrew word shekel. A shekel was a unit of weight, but the word can be translated to weigh or to be found light or wanting. Daniel interpreted it to mean you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom, the days of your kingdom is numbered and come to an end. The reason it is because God has weighed you and you're light in the loafers here. Pharsin, which is related to the Hebrew word paris, which was a unit of weight, half shekel. So the writing said Pharsin, Daniel interpreted Perez, P-E-R-E-S, which was a unit of weight, a half shekel. The word also can be translated divided, and as a play on words, it also could refer to the Persians. So Daniel interpreted it to mean your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So most people believe he translated it this to have the play on words for there, because these two words are related. So that's what most Bible interpreters think. Why switch the word, even though they mean basically the same thing? Okay. Through the handwriting, Belshazzar was made to understand that Babylon would fall to the enemies that were besieging the city at that moment. Even while Daniel was interpreting the writing, the prophecy was being fulfilled as the Medes and the Persians poured into the city. I think I have something about that. Y'all know how they did that, right? How the Persians took the city. They diverted the water and came in under the wall through the riverbank, through the riverbed. I think I got some stuff about that. But then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck. A proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So Cyrus was the head of the Persians, and Darius was the head of the Medes. Okay. Prophecy anticipating the fall of Babylon is found both in Isaiah and Jeremiah, written many years before. Both prophets had said that Babylon would fall to the Medes on just such a night of revelry. Thank you, as Daniel records. And that's where that is. Some of these prophecies may have their ultimate fulfillment in the future. They were partially fulfilled then, they'll be more fully fulfilled. Very interesting, Isaiah named Cyrus as the one that would let them go, but he named the Medes as the people who would actually cause the city to fall. That's how specific God is with prophecy, isn't it? Fascinating. Finally, the tidings, fallen is Babylon, and all the carved images of their God he has shattered to the ground. That's Isaiah 21:9. Jeremiah is explicit, I will make drunk her officials and her wise men, her governors, her commanders, her warriors. They shall sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake, declares the King, whose name is the Lord of hosts. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the broad wall of Babylon shall be leveled to the ground, and her high gates shall be burned with fire. And they did that after they took it. Daniel himself recorded with simplicity the fulfillment of the prophecy. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. The concluding verse of the chapter records that how Darius the Mede became the ruler of Babylon at age 62. Daniel survived the purge, emerged triumphant as one of the presidents of the new kingdom. God just don't go away. It's fascinating that he survived all of these changes, and not only survived them, but become important in them. There is an interesting account surrounding the city. We got about 5 minutes. Herodias says, the Babylonians were shut up in the city, but as they had been long aware of the restless spirit of Cyrus, they saw that he attacked all nations alike. They laid up provisions for many years, therefore were under no apprehensions about a siege. On the other hand, Cyrus found himself in difficulty. Much more time had elapsed, and his affairs were not at all advanced. Whether, therefore, someone else made the suggestion to him in his perplexity, or whether he himself devised the plan, he had recourse to the following strategy. Having stationed the bulk of his army near the passage of the river where it entered Babylon, and again stationed another division beyond the city where the city makes its exit, he gave orders to his forces to enter the city as soon as they seen the stream was fordable. Having stationed his forces and given these directions, he himself marched away with the ineffective part of his army having come to the lake. Cyrus did the same with respect to the river and the lake as the queen of Babylon had done, for having diverted the river by the means of a canal into a lake, which is before the swamp, he made the ancient channel fordable by sinking the level of the river. When this took place, the Persians, who were appointed to that purpose close to the stream of the river, which had now subsided to about the middle of a man's thigh, entered Babylon by that passage. If, however, the Babylonians had been aware of it beforehand or known what Cyrus was about, they would have not have suffered the Persians to enter the city, but would have destroyed them for having shut off all the little gates that led to the river, and mounting the walls that extend along the banks of the river, they would have caught them in a net. Whereas the Persians came on them by surprise, it's related by the people who inhabited the city that by reason of its great extent when they who were at the extremities were taken, those of the Babylonians who inhabited the center knew nothing of the capture, for it happened during time of a festival. But they were dancing at the time and enjoying themselves, and received information finally, and thus Babylon was taken for the first time. So, interesting stuff.
They were so caught up in their revelry that they didn't even know that the city had been taken all around.
No, they were doing their drunken dance.
Too, in Revelation, it says the Euphrates will be dried up.
Say it again.
In Revelation, it says that the Euphrates river will be dried up, just like it was there.
Yeah.
It was overtaken.
So the Chinese can come across.
So if you're stuck in the world system, then, or in Babylon,
Yeah.
it will be dried up.
Yeah. In Revelation, it says that there will be 200 million man army come across there, which is most likely the Chinese. Yeah. Okay, we got that done in 1 week. That's amazing. That's a miracle in itself.
So have you talked about where Nebuchadnezzar, whenever he was crazy for 7 years, that they thought he might be in his garden or whatever and taking care of it? It actually says when he was explaining to
Yeah, I got that.
he was fed grass.
Yeah.
Not like he was eating there, he was fed grass like a beast.
Yeah. So somebody was out there keeping an eye on him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it says also that they drove him out, which it seemed like it was just his madness that drove him out, but it says specifically they. I was trying to look at the wording there. But
Yeah. Okay, you want to dismiss us, Jonathan?